Okay, time for our next lesson because in our last lesson, we had seen Samuel anoint David to be the next king. Okay, when we talked about how there was still some time to come before he would actually become king. So, David, we know, was a shepherd, and he was a good shepherd to the flock of sheep that he was responsible for. And as he watched his sheep, scripture tells us that he played his harp and he sang to the Lord, and God seemed very close to him ever since he was anointed by Samuel. Well, because David loved the Lord, whatever he did, he always did it as if he was doing it for the Lord. Shepherds usually carried a shepherd's staff, and it had a lot of practical uses. It wasn't just a walking stick. The crook on the end was used to pull in a wandering or wayward sheep. Sometimes it was used for protection. Often a snake would slither through the grass and frighten the sheep, but David was ready with his rod, and he always kept a slingshot nearby too. He practiced hurling stones with his sling until he became an expert. Well, when a sheep or lamb strayed out of sight, David would climb up on a high rock and he began calling that sheep by name because the sheep knew his voice and they obeyed him. And each evening, David would examine his sheep as they went under his rod through the entrance into the sheepfold. And if a sheep was bruised or cut, then he would pour soothing oil on that sore spot to help it heal. Well, one day while David was watching his sheep, scripture tells us that he hears this long, deep growl. So he jumps to his feet just in time to see this huge bear carrying off in his mouth one of David's lambs. And David asked God to help him, and he ran toward that bear, and he killed that bear with his own hands, saving that terrified little lamb. And then he picked up the lamb and he comforted him. And another time while he was watching his sheep, a big hungry lion creeps into the flock and grabbed a young sheep, started to run away. And immediately David runs after him. Well, the lion drops the sheep and then furiously turns on David. So he grabs the beast, and with his own hands, he also kills a lion. Well, it was the Spirit of God that gave David the courage and the power to defend his sheep from the bear and the lion. And David was learning to trust God with the problems of his life. And think about it. Do we have problems? And then, like David, we can ask God to help us with our problems too. We can trust Him for our problems just like David did. Remember, the Bible tells us that the devil goes about as a roaring lion seeking whom he may devour. Well, God can help us overcome the devil just as he helped David overcome the lion and the bear. Well, David sang a glad song of thanksgiving to the Lord after such experiences because he knew that it was God that protected him and helped him. In fact, David sang so well that when others heard him, they would call him the sweet singer of Israel. He played and he sang and used his harp day after day while he was taking care of his sheep. And he soon became a very skilled harp player as well as a good singer. His name became well known for this. Well, think about shepherds and their jobs. Okay, they're often alone, right? So David had a lot of time to talk to God, and he soon learned to know the Lord like a friend and to trust him. And he sang songs about the beauty of God's wonderful outdoor world. He sang about the Lord being his shepherd. That's Psalms 23. Okay, a lot of us are familiar with that psalm. He sang about the loveliness of the early morning, and we see that in Psalms 19, and the wonder of night. He sang about the comfort and the help that God gives in times of trouble. And for hundreds of years, people of all ages have been blessed and strengthened by the songs that David wrote. And we have so many of them as Psalms, Psalms, in the Bible. And although David had been anointed king, he still wouldn't become king for a long time. Because guess who was still king? That was King Saul. And King Saul was frustrated and he was troubled in his mind. And the prophet Samuel told him, "The Lord has rejected you from being the king of Israel." Well, from then on, after he heard that news, Saul went down, down, down. The Lord had given him up to his own evil heart, and the Spirit of the Lord had left him. an evil spirit had filled him with fear and depression, and it made him gloomy and grumpy, and his disposition was just ugly. All right. God's presence was gone, and that made Saul cry out in despair. He said that he was so distressed because God had departed from him and didn't answer him anymore. Well, King Saul spent long days and nights feeling downcast and tormented, and restlessness and a storm of worry filled his heart. And some who served him noticed this really drastic change in him, and they felt sorry for him. So they were trying to suggest a cure so the king would feel better. I said, let's try some good music. Someone to sing and play a harp, maybe soothe his frayed nerves. Maybe that'll help him feel better. And, we've heard of this young shepherd who plays the harp and sings real sweet, soothing music. So maybe whenever the evil spirit's bothering Saul, that music will soothe him and quiet his spirit and make him feel peaceful again. So they all talked about this, and Saul agreed to their idea because he was so miserable. He was willing to try anything. So one of the servants said, this young shepherd lives in Bethlehem, and he's the son of a man named Jesse. And he's not only a good musician, but he's a handsome, brave soldier as well, and the Lord is with him. So Saul sent messengers to Jesse, asking him to send his son David, the shepherd, to the palace, for the king needed him. Well, Jesse called David from the field and told him about the king's message, and David left to go to Saul, carrying a present from his father to the king. So as David begins to play sweet music on his harp, Scripture tells us that Saul immediately began to feel better. Saul immediately begins to feel better. The king listens intently to the music, and later he talked to David. And he right away liked David and even admired him. And David became Saul's armor bearer, kind of like his bodyguard, as well as the king's musician. Whenever this evil spirit troubled the king, David would play soothing music to refresh Saul and bring calm and quiet to his spirit. Well, King Saul felt that he needed David. So he wrote to Jesse, remember David's dad, and said, please let David stay with me and serve on my staff, for he pleases me very much. Well, little did Saul know that David had been anointed to become the next king of Israel. Well, from that time on, David spent his time at the palace. He learned a lot about the duties of a king and about things that would be very helpful to him in the years that would follow. And what a contrast this is. Just look at this picture. On the throne sat proud, rebellious King Saul, who had started out so well, but he had become proud and arrogant and disobedient and now even miserable. And instead of surrendering to the Lord, King Saul allowed himself, not God, to rule on the throne of his heart and his life. And though in the past he had led Israel to great military victories, he took the credit for himself. And gradually he felt like he didn't need God. He became consumed with promoting his own plans and his own agenda. And when he had disobeyed God, he argued back and he excused himself from obeying the Lord. And now he was in a terrible, very troubled state of mind. But near the throne of King Saul sat youthful David, and his cheerful expression and his thoughtful ways, and God had anointed a man after his own heart to be the next king. David showed on his face that he had become a good friend of God. David was truly a man after God's own heart, the kind of man that God would be able to use. And though David had already been anointed king in Saul's place by the prophet Samuel, he was willing to still serve Saul or tend to his father's sheep or whatever else was needed until it was God's timing for him to be the king. So we have to think, are we like David? Are we willing and obedient and cheerful? Or are we rebellious and selfish, kind of like King Saul? Okay? You can be like David by saying no to yourself and selfish things and saying yes to God. Remember the scripture we talked about earlier, man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart. As God looks deep within our hearts right now, will you ask Him to forgive your selfishness and your rebellion, and ask Him to help you live pure and to live right before Him?